Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. I'm going to go through a club game that I played. Ian, our team captain, just asked me to cough up the details because he couldn't make it. So here we go. Knight f3. I tend to play knight f6 here. It's a nice flexible move. My opponent plays c4. This is a clever move order. Basically avoids the Grunfeld. So I had a choice here. I thought about playing e6, which is, I think the engine looks stockfish, depth 61. e6 is its favourite choice. Of course, c5 is a good move here. But I chose to play g6, probably knowing that my opponent would be avoiding the Grunfeld. So knight c3. So what my opponent wants to do is play e4 next. So if you want to play a Grunfeld type, then you've got to play d5 here, which is actually the engine's choice, and it's not bad. But I didn't want to do that tonight. I played bishop g7. My opponent went ahead and played e4 as expected. At this point, you've got to play d6. Well, you haven't got to, but I did, because basically you want to prevent pawn e5. My opponent then played d4, and as if by magic, a King's Indian defence has appeared on the board. So I castle. Matthew Holmes. Bishop e2. I thought quite hard here. I thought about playing knight b d7 because Gwaine Jones has pioneered this move. And it's an interesting move. It stops the exchange variation. It's probably slightly less learning driven than the kind of e5 knight c6 where there's a lot of theory. So it's perhaps a bit more strategic, a bit less forcing. But on this occasion, I just thought, well, let's go mainline theory, e5. White can take here, which I was thinking about and actually a bit worried about because, you know, white can take on e5, black takes back. Many of you will know this. Queen takes, rook takes. But, I mean, there's two things wrong with this. The first is it's stuck black's rook on an open file. The second is white has swapped the d4 pawn for black's d6 pawn, which is not really in the classical tradition. So there are issues with that, but it's maybe a way to play if you think that black's looking for tactics. Anyway, white didn't do it. White castle, this is the absolute main line. Black went ahead and played knight c6. d5 from white is standard, closing the centre. Knight e7 is standard. And then white went ahead and played knight e1. Now this, every King's Indian player wants to see this. This is why people play the King's Indian, for this sort of position. And the only question that enters your head now is white going to play bishop e3 later on, which allows you to play f4 with tempo, or is that bishop going to go to d2? But basically, the most popular move and the engine move is knight d7, preparing f5. White plays knight d3. Again, it's the most popular move, centralizing that knight. f5 from black is absolutely natural. This is where black's activity is. So basically what's happened is each side has its own sphere of influence. So white's sphere of influence is on the queen's side and black's is on the king's side. White played f3 here. Now, this is actually the engine move, although Matthew said he wasn't sure he had to play it. And actually, I think sometimes white waits until black plays knight f6 here before playing f3. Well, actually, it's the engine move, so, you know, nothing too much to worry about there. I pushed on and played f4, which is the most popular move in the position. So basically, we're still in theory. It's move 11. Bishop d2, still theory. Now I deviated. So g5 is the common move here. But I played rook f7, which may look mysterious, but it's a move that has three purposes. Firstly, it defends c7, which will come in handy later. Secondly, it frees up f8 for the dark square bishop. And thirdly, it's thinking of swinging across to either the G or the H file to carry out an attack on the king. So we often like moves that serve two purposes, but this serves three purposes. White played king f1, which this is a new move. So this is a novelty on move 13. I think I've seen Firouzja play this, and I think I might have seen Carlsen play it too. I mean, not quite in this position, but this idea, and I think they sometimes play rook g1 afterwards, is basically a way to try to impede black's attack, although it looks a bit frightening to me. And actually, I think this comes in quite handy. So I think this is a good move, and it'd be good to know if Matthew had seen it being played at the elite levels, or if he just felt it was right. Maybe sometimes you can have c6, queen b6 creates a check. So maybe he just worked it out on the spur of the moment, which is very impressive. Pawn g5, got to get those pawns moving. The whole idea is to carry out a kingside pawn storm. White's playing b4, which is a natural and good move, preparing c5. And now this knight on d7, its work is done, because it was stopping the c5 break, but now that can no longer be stopped. So the knight goes to f6, threatening black's g4 break, or at least particularly after black's played h5, it really will be threatening it. I mean, you could do it now, but it's a sack now. But basically starting to prepare the g4 break. C5 from white. I mean, isn't it a beautiful position? You know, it's shaping up for a really unbalanced, interesting sort of conflict. Basically, I've got a reputation in the club for being a bit of a sort of, you know, grinder of end games, and a bit of a sort of 3 pawns, a rook and a knight versus 2 pawns, a rook and a bishop. So basically, we're trying to dispel those unfortunate views by playing some interesting and sharp chess. Although what's interesting about this game is I actually end up, let's not spoil it, let's just keep playing. Okay, let's see what happens. So after c5, h5, preparing g4. Now my opponent's worried about this, so he plays knight f2. So now this break would have to be a sack, which doesn't rule it out, but I chose not to do it. I played bishop f8, basically preparing to defend this pawn with the bishop, but also later you can defend it with the knight on e8, and actually that defends the c7 square as well, so that's quite helpful. So my opponent swapped. Engine doesn't like this swap, by the way, but I don't quite know why. It's a very standard thing to do. And then played rook c1. So I think the idea here is to create an invasion on c7. I think it's quite a standard idea, and actually I think my opponent plays this in a very thematic sort of way, i.e. very much in the spirit of the line and the opening. So rook g7, look at that, nothing subtle about this, is there? So let's do a quick count. How many pieces defending? If you advance here, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, going the other way. So basically I can now carry out the advance. Unfortunately, white has knight b5. So I did a bit of thinking here about whether I should carry out the push. The engine wants knight g6, which is not a bad move. I didn't like it because it got in the way of the rook on the g file, but it does allow the rook to defend c7. So that might have been preferable. Well, the engine thinks it is preferable. I ended up playing knight e8, defending, again, this is standard in these positions, defending the d pawn and the c7 square. And so there's sort of a tension here between our plans, because I needed that knight to support the g4 push, but now it's been distracted by having to defend on c7, not really so much on d6, mainly c7. And because the danger is it goes to c7, it hits the rook, and then it ends up landing on e6, and you end up having to give up your light square bishop for it. And I need that light square bishop, because when I play pawn g3 and then white plays h3, I need to sack the bishop on h3, and then you got a pawn on g3, your queen can come around, take that, the other pawn, and then basically give mate on h2. That's the general sort. What's an idea? And if the knight's landed on e6 and the bishop had to be given up, you can't do that. So my knight's come back to e8 to stop any of that nonsense. But as I say, the engine wanted knight g6 instead. A4 is it's the engine's first choice. It's a good move. There's a reason for it, but it sort of makes sense. It's just queenside activity. A6 to get rid of that knight. The knight rightly goes to a3 because it's planning to come c4, b6 after white plays a5. But now it's gone back to a3. I can reposition the knight to f6, again threatening the big g4 push. White plays a5 and I play g4. Now I'm feeling really good now, because look at this. I'm sort of playing like a 14-year-old, schoolboy. Like, just let's try and smash through on the king side. And got to say, my opponent, who defended this brilliantly, he defended ever so well. He was just staring at the king side, like, because there's so many ways to get mated. King's got no space. These bishops are awful. You're not doing anything. It just feels terrifying. The rook's looking. The queen, you might even sack one of these knights on d5. I think I saw a Kasparov game when he sacked it maybe on d5 or maybe on e4 to make space for the queen. You could sack a knight at some point for 2 pawns on d5, or there's various, all sorts of tactical motifs sort of arise. So it really is like, just let's go back to that very sort of optimistic form of chess where you just say we're going to attack. The engine, by the way, has white plus 1.3. So the engine has white better, but engines have no fear. And I think, it's a classic thing, isn't it? Which is white might win a pawn on the queen side, might even win a rook. But if you're giving checkmate, none of that matters. And so certainly my opponent we were all staring at the king's side, and he was burning quite a lot of time here trying to, construct what was a very good defense. So knight c4, so absolutely no fear. g3, in it goes. Now g3 is an interesting move because, white doesn't have h3. If that knight wasn't there, if that knight had had time to get away, white could play h3 here. And sure, you could still sack the bishop at some point, but you're having to sack a piece to break through. Otherwise, the king's side's just sealed. But after g3, that's less the case. Knight b6. So I looked at taking the knight here. He takes the rook. But frankly, then my attack's just fizzled out, and I'm just in a straight exchange down. It just doesn't work. So it looks like there aren't any sort of clever tactics that you can really, because there's lots of interesting games where people just sack the rook in the corner and just throw everything at the king's side, but on this occasion I just couldn't make that work, so we didn't do any of that. So he's gone knight b6. I basically just say, well, that rook is attacked, so what we're going to do is just move the rook across. The engine likes that, although it also likes the bishop there. Knight takes my lovely light square bishop, which is often very useful in the King's Indian. I decided to take back with the rook because I can't have that rook so inactive on the b file. Take back with the rook. Now there's always the risk of white taking here and distracting either my queen or my knight, although I might like the knight to be distracted because it would allow my queen to move to the king's side. Also, white still has this problem, which is what's white going to do about the king's side? And what's white's going to do is move the knight to d3. Again, the engine has white better. The engine wants white to take on g3, but I don't know, it terrifies me because you just think, h takes, f takes, and then all the queen needs to do is get to h4, land on h2, and it's the end of days. But of course, white can move the knight to h3 and block it, but still, my black knight can go h7, g5, try to remove that knight. Just feels really scary, but the engine wants to take on g3. Anyway, my opponent makes what I would call the human move, knight d3. There's nothing like having one of your pawns on the 7th rank. So I'm a pawn up now because white chooses not to take this, gh. In fact, what white chooses to do is play queen a4, get the queen active. I actually didn't like this very much because there's no entry squares. I'm not quite sure what that queen's doing. Maybe it's planning to support b5, which is not a bad idea. And in fact, later on it does get active, so it proves to be quite useful. I found the engine move here, h4. The idea is to go knight h5 and then land it on that delicious g3 square. I was expecting sort of bishop e1 to stop all of this, but none of that happened. White took here, doesn't want the fork on g3, so decided to take here. I think one of my teammates suggested pushing h3 either here or another position. I think that's a really good idea. But I went knight h5. White's knight comes to f2. This turns out to be a very useful defensive piece. Played knight g3, hitting the rook and the bishop. There's one obvious move, which is for the rook to defend the bishop. Now I can take here under good circumstances, because obviously there's no rook takes because the bishop drops, so it has to be bishop takes. That isn't a great square for the bishop. It's somewhat misplaced, although it's not the worst square in the world either. And now I played what I consider to be quite a deep move, which is king h7. The idea is you go knight g8, knight h6 to try to remove this knight, which I was expecting to embed itself on g4. There are some lines when you can take on e2, rook takes, and then take with the rook on g4, take with the queen. The problem is you're slightly running out of pieces. So, there might have been an exchange sack on g4, but I chose to try to bring the knight to h6 to try to get rid of that. But my opponent played bishop a3, which is a good move, and actually was a move which I allowed by taking there. So maybe I just got that wrong. Knight g8 from me. So what I'm planning to do is I'm making way for the queen, and also I am thinking of bringing this knight around to squares like h6. But white does something clever here, knight h3. This is a good square for the knight. For instance, it stops queen g5. Because, of course, what I want to do is play queen g5, like sack the knight somewhere and just take on g2, checkmate. But the knight on h3 is actually quite good at stopping a bunch of things. It stops pawn h3, and it stops the queen coming to g5, which becomes quite important. So I play the knight to h6. I think maybe I'm thinking f7 and g5, which actually turns out to be, the engine likes that sort of theme. That turns out to be quite a good idea. b5 from white is the correct move. And now we got a problem because white might well be winning a pawn on the queen's side. I mean, I could have taken this to stop it, but instead I chose to kind of go all in, whatever that means, and just let the pawn go and play queen f6. Now, the engine hates this. The engine thinks this is a losing move because what the engine sees is takes, and my opponent sees is takes, and then actually the engine would just take with the bishop, but my opponent, I think quite a good move, plays queen e8 with the idea of queen e6, killing off my attack just with an extra pawn on the queen side. This is looking like a really good thing, and I started to feel a bit uncomfortable here. I started to think, oh, this is fizzling out, and the attack's fizzling out, and actually white's going to break through on the queen side. This is all going to be bad. So I played what I considered to be a rather good move. Engine wants to take on e2, but the engine thinks basically I'm lost here. I played what I thought was quite a good move. I was reasonably confident here. I think I was a bit higher on time. Played bishop e7, so stopping queen e6. But oddly, later on we'll see that, and this is, again, the engine hates it. Later we'll see that queen e6 is actually a bad move, hilariously. Anyway, white just took this pawn, and so now this pawn is running quite quickly with quite a lot of pieces covering it, and so I have to, rustle up some activity very quickly. Rook g8, just hitting the queen and kind of thinking of rook a8 to cause some trouble down this file where there's a lot of pieces lined up who sort of can't defend each other. It's all very weak. So my opponent played queen d7, which I think is natural and good. And now my rook a8 is no good because there's a queen b7. It's just wasting time, so it doesn't work. So what I thought was, this was a bit tricky of me. This is where it's a swindle. I thought of rook d8, and I thought my opponent is going to want to get the queens off because that's what he's been playing for. And he's just want to sort of kill off that attack because it's a very human thing. And then the thought is, well, he'll win the endgame. He'll win on the queen side. So I thought rook d8. He's going to try to play queen e6, but then I sort of realised if I take it and he takes and I play rook a8, there's no queen b7 anymore, and actually that bishop's going to move. I take the pawn, and I've actually got the better endgame because that pawn on e6 is weak. So hilariously, I actually end up playing a slightly better endgame in my view. So rook d8, the engine's very clear that if white just plays like queen b7 and just shepherds the pawn through, white's +6. Unfortunately for white, chose to go this way. Again, the engine has white better, but takes, rook a8 is now causing a lot more problems. And also, White was quite low on time because he had played very well in defending on the king side, but it took a lot of brain power because there was so many sort of risks, really. So rook here, bishop b7, which I think was slightly inaccurate, and so does the engine. Takes on a5, and then my opponent instantly blitzed out rook a1 to defend the bishop, and immediately your spidey sense says, well, hang on, that bishop's pinned against the rook. So there's this move d5, isn't there? So I went for a drink, because I had a bit more time on the clock. I went for a drink, had to think about this, had a check of it. So pawn d5, so if the bishop takes, then I take the rook, and the fear is that there's a sort of a pawn take situation, and actually there's some pawns rolling, so even though you're the exchange up, you might have all sorts of problems. But then I realised the point is d5, bishop takes on e7, take the rook. If you take the pawn, then there's rook h1 is checkmate, and that knight on there has proved to do a really good job. So unfortunately for white, there's a few tactics that cause all sorts of trouble. So I did play the engine move d5. My opponent, the engine move is here, bishop b2, which defends the rook, which does allow the fork on b5. So there's lots of complexity there, which he didn't go for. He just took very quickly on e7. I took reasonably quickly on a1. So now we know that takes here is rewarded by a mate here. My opponent spotted this, played knight g1 to block. Now the engine really does think I'm better. I was kind of worried, understandably. I wanted to play rook a7 here and win another minor. But then, of course, you've got ED, and you've got two connected pawns. Rooks aren't very good at dealing with those. The knights are really awkward here. None of the knights can get round to help. Spent a lot of time calculating this. Let's just look what the engine says. So what I did was I took here. But actually, let's just look what the engine says if you play rook a7. The engine says, I bet the engine says it's okay. The engine says white's a little bit better because white takes on d5. Yeah. So you get the minor piece, but I think those connected pass pawns d6. It's a struggle. So actually, I'm glad I didn't fall for that. So I took here. Now my opponent was saying he wanted to take with the bishop, but he got confused. Take the bishop check. I assume I'll take with the knight. So he took here, which he ended up not liking, and it is not as good. He wanted to take with the bishop. I mean, I assume then you just take with the knight. Yeah, I mean, black's still winning this, frankly. So, because black's an exchange up, right? So, fine. But he took with the... So, my big swindle really was to force the queens off in a situation where it looked like I was actually attacking. So now it says I'm plus 56, which is probably quite good news, and it wants to play knight f1 check, king h3, knight e3. I'm afraid I wasn't quite that smart. I think let me just find what I played. I played rook a7, which, it's the human move, isn't it? That's like just, try to win a bishop. The pawns aren't as scary anymore. My opponent played in a very enterprising way here. Took on h4. Well, but that knight's not going to be lost, so you can just snaffle the bishop. And here, this was unforgivable. But it's quite interesting psychologically. I missed a beautiful checkmate, which would have made this a really nice evening. So I, being a human being, just snaffled off the bishop. I had 10 minutes on the clock. I could have looked at this. But of course, well, I'm going to stop the clock for a minute. And so all of you really smart chess players can spot what black should have done here. Please feel free to pause the video. I'm stopping the clock. Okay, pause the video. Right, so the beautiful move, which of course the engine's found, because engines are like that. Knight g4, king has to go here. Knight f2, king has to go back. Oh, look at that. Hoof prints. Knight f1, at least we can look at it on the video, even though I didn't pull it off on the knight. Knight f1, and that is checkmate, and that is a lovely and very novel ending. So even though the knight on f2 can be taken, there's no time to take it. Of course, the knight on g1 has caused the problem. That would have been my whole attack would have actually succeeded, and I would have won the mantle of as an attacking player, whereas, as ever, I've just shown myself to be someone who just grabs the material and then tries to win the endgame. So I grab the material. My opponent, and to be fair to me, it's always nice to be fair to yourself. You know, this is gone. It's kind of +10 to black. So, that's just the way it went. White played a good move here. E7. I had a little heart in mouth moment where I thought, oh gosh, is that queening? And then I saw the rook could stop it, because clearly the knights can't stop it. So that was a horrible moment, not least because the whole match depended on this game. By the way, the knight g4 checkmate is still there. Didn't see it again because I was, it's an interesting psychological focus. You're just terrified of this pawn queening. Well, actually, there's checkmate. Black has checkmate in 3, forced. But you just think that's going to queen, that's going to queen. It takes up all your attention. So I just played rook b8 to stop it queening. That's fine. All the danger's gone. Nothing can cover the a8 square. I'm not going to lose a piece here. So the rook went here. White played knight f3. Again, the good moves just keep coming. White's done so well here. Attacking this pawn, the e5 pawn. I played knight g4 here. Again, there's a forced mate, although this forced mate is really hard to see. So I played knight g4, and then after king g1, the rook check at the back, the rook check on b1 is, as we can see, fatal, and it's a beautiful checkmate. So white correctly played to h3. I then played knight f2, which is in the mating sequence. White went to h2, and then I copped out and took the material on e4. So I took here with the knight on e4, But as it happens, and I don't beat myself up for not seeing this, because this is a hard one to see. What would have been lovely is rook b1, which threatens mate here. And then what white would play is, okay, so there's a sort of check that just wastes everyone's time. Well, there's a check. And then you can sort of go king here, probably. Does that kill it off? And then, okay, only you can't do that because of the pawn queens. Let's not do that. You do king here. I mean, actually, it still wins, but you can't be letting pawns queen like that. Then there's another knight check. These are just putting off the inevitable. Then there's a king here. Then this is the point. Then, well, let's play it this way. If the bishop takes, you've still got the mate here, which is a kind of crazy mate, because the bishop's got no time to take the knight on f2 again, and it's checkmate. And the bishop's sort of in the way of the king, although the pawn's covering the square. But I do not feel guilty about not finding that, because with that little time on the clock, you're trying to avoid getting into awful time pressure. And I think because you've got a materially won position, it's kind of, well, it's what happened is I just said, look, we're having the pawn. I realise he's going to take here, but the material's just a lot better. So what did my opponent play? Knight f3, knight g4. He took. Get this right. So he took on e5, of course. I like this move, actually. This is a good move. I was proud of this. Knight f5, which is not the engine move, but it's an engine move. Knight f5, attacking the bishop and attacking this troublesome pawn. So that created a lot of problems. My opponent played knight d7, hitting my rook. Natural to put it in front of the pawn. There's no knight f6, which is really good to know because it's covered by my knight. But looks like white has to move the bishop away and let me take the pawn. But white played the tricky bishop g5. If I take that, there's then a check on f6. I think we're still winning that endgame, but it's really grisly because let's all remember that king and two knights can't checkmate a king because there's a stalemate problem in the checkmating sequence. So I avoided all of that business and just played king g6, which the engine approves of. White took here. It's getting towards the end now, really. Knight takes pawn. I think knight here check was played. My king moves up, sort of attacking both minor pieces. I mean, you can even call it a fork. It's not really a fork, but attacking both mana pieces. Nice centralized king. That's what the endgame's all about. G3 protects the bishop, which is protecting the knight, which looks nice. I played knight d5. I think by now my opponent's probably had enough of all of this. King g2, and then I took twice here, and at that point my opponent had the good grace to resign. As it happens, there's a forced mating sequence in 9, but I think more substantially at some point we're going to find a way to pick that knight off and deliver checkmate. So congratulations to my opponent. Great defense, a really hard fought game. I sort of suppose what I did was I played a King's Indian defense a bit like a Queen's Gambit declined, as in a sort of positional game. But you know, it was an interesting game of chess. I enjoyed it a lot. I really appreciate, you know, my opponent putting all that effort into it, and it's been nice sharing it with you. Any comments? It'd be really good to hear them, and hope to see you soon.